In the early months of 1943, the skies over Europe underwent a terrifying transformation. For the first 3 years of the war, the rhythm of destruction had been set by the British Royal Air Force. The RAF, having learned a bloody lesson about the lethality of German flak and fighters, operated under the cloak of darkness. They were night ghosts, dropping their payloads and vanishing before dawn. The Luftwaffe pilots, the Jagdflieger, ruled the daylight. They believed that any bomber foolish enough to fly while the sun was high was essentially signing its own death warrant. Then came the Americans. The United States Army Air Forces arrived with a doctrine that sounded like madness to the veteran German pilots: daylight precision bombing. They would fly straight into the heart of the Reich, in broad daylight, with no fighter escort, deep into Germany. The Luftwaffe commanders rubbed their hands in anticipation. They expected a slaughter. They expected the American formations to break apart like frightened birds at the first sign of a Messerschmitt. But when the first intercepts began, the German pilots realized with a jolt of horror that the Flying Fortress was not just a propaganda name, it was a literal description. Oberleutnant Hans Knoke, one of the early aces to encounter them, described the sight as something out of a nightmare. The B-17s didn't fly alone. They flew in a combat box, a tight three-dimensional formation of 18 to 21 aircraft stacked in steps. From a distance, they looked like a swarm of slow-moving silver insects. But as the German fighters closed in for the kill, the insects began to bite. The shock was the defensive firepower. A single Messerschmitt Bf-109 attacking a standard bomber usually only had to worry about one or two defensive guns firing rifle-caliber bullets, but approaching a combat box of B-17s was different. Each bomber bristled with up to 13 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns. These weren't the light paint-scratching weapons the Germans were used to. The Maid Deuce fired a thumb-sized slug that could tear an engine block apart or sever a wing spar. When a German fighter squadron dived on a B-17 formation, they weren't facing one gun. Because of the interlocking fields of fire, a single attacking fighter might be targeted by the guns of 5 or 6 different bombers simultaneously. It was a wall of lead. German radio channels filled with panicked shouts. Pilots who tried the standard attack, coming in from the tail, found themselves flying directly into the face of the new twin-gun tail turrets that ripped their canopies to shreds. Those who tried to attack from below, thinking the belly was soft, were met with the Sperry ball turret, a spinning sphere of death that tracked them perfectly. It was like attacking a flying porcupine, one German veteran later recalled. There was no blind spot. Everywhere you looked, a barrel was pointing at you. And then there was the durability. The Luftwaffe pilots were used to planes that crumbled when hit, but the B-17 was built like a bridge. German pilots watched in disbelief as they pumped 20mm cannon shells into the wings and fuselage of the American giants, chunks of metal flying off, engines catching fire, and yet the B-17s kept flying. They held their formation. They didn't scatter. They simply absorbed the punishment and kept marching toward the target. By the end of those initial encounters, the arrogance of the Luftwaffe had evaporated. The easy hunts were over. They realized they were facing a new kind of enemy, a machine that carried its own air superiority with it, a beast that could bleed oil and fire and still drag its crew home. The daylight was no longer theirs. The terror had arrived, and it had 4 engines and 1,000 guns. Deep behind the German lines, hidden within the pine forests of Verneuken Airfield, a phantom unit was operating in total silence. This was the home of Kampfgeschwader 200, KG 200.
To the average Luftwaffe pilot, this unit was a rumor. To the Allies, it was a myth. But inside the hangars of Verneuken, the impossible was happening. The enemy's greatest weapon was being resurrected. The United States Army Air Forces had a problem. Their pilots were too good at surviving. When a B-17 Flying Fortress was heavily damaged by flak or fighters, the crew was trained not to dive into the ground, but to perform a controlled belly landing. They would skid across the flat farmlands of France or Germany, engines dead, propellers bent, but the fuselage largely intact. For the specialized recovery teams of the Luftwaffe, these crash sites were gold mines. As soon as the American crews were captured and marched away, the German technicians arrived. They were the scavengers of the air war. They brought heavy cranes, flatbed trucks, and a shopping list. If a B-17 had a crushed nose but a perfect tail, they took the tail. If another had a burning fuselage but pristine wings, they took the wings. They hauled these massive carcasses back to the secret workshops of KG-200 with a singular, audacious goal: to build their own flying fortresses. The engineering challenge was a nightmare. The German mechanics, arguably the best in the world, were suddenly confronted with American mass production. Nothing fit. The Germans worked in the metric system. The Americans worked in inches and feet. A German wrench would strip an American bolt. A German fuel hose wouldn't fit an American pump. The mechanics at Verneuken had to improvise. They hand-tooled new parts. They translated captured technical manuals from English to German, puzzling over American slang and technical jargon. They had to figure out the complex Wright Cyclone engines, which were vastly different from the Daimler-Benz engines they knew. It was a forensic puzzle. They were trying to bring a dead machine back to life without the instructions. To maintain secrecy, the deception began on the ground. In the official Luftwaffe logbooks, these captured B-17s were never listed by their real names. That would raise too many questions. Instead, they were given the code name Dornier 200. If a supply clerk saw a request for parts for a Dornier 200, he asked no questions, assuming it was a new experimental German bomber. Slowly, the Frankenstein monsters began to take shape. The battered aluminum was smoothed out, the shattered glass of the turrets was replaced. But the most jarring transformation was the paint. The mechanics scraped away the white star of the U.S. Army Air Forces. In its place, they stenciled the sharp black Balkenkreuz, the Iron Cross, on the wings and fuselage. On the tail, where the colorful insignia of an American bomb group usually sat, they painted a bright, terrifying swastika. By late 1943, the Rosarius Circus, a special subsection often associated with KG-200, had achieved the impossible. They had a small, operational fleet of B-17s and B-24s. These planes were fully airworthy, fueled with high-octane gas and armed with German ammunition that had been modified to fit American machine guns. As the first rebuilt B-17 rolled out onto the runway at Verneuken, its engines coughing into life with that distinct American radio roar, it was a triumph of engineering and a masterpiece of espionage. The Luftwaffe now possessed the one thing that could turn the tide of the air war. They had the enemy's playbook. They could fly it, they could test it, and most importantly, they could learn how to kill it. The Ghost Squadron was ready for takeoff.
The morning mist hung low over the Recklen Test Center, the Luftwaffe's top-secret experimental facility. On the tarmac sat a machine that looked utterly alien amidst the sleek, angular shapes of German engineering. It was a B-17 Flying Fortress, captured intact, its silver skin now scarred with the black cross of the Wehrmacht. Oberst Colonel Werner Baumbach, one of the Luftwaffe's most decorated bomber pilots, walked toward the giant.
He had spent years fighting against the British and the Soviets, but this American beast was a mystery. To the German fighter pilots, it was a Wehrmacht, a four-engine terror. Today, Baumbach wasn't going to shoot at it, he was going to fly it. Climbing through the forward hatch, the first thing that struck the German officers was the smell. It didn't smell like a German plane. German cockpits smelled of high-octane synthetic fuel, hot metal, and stale sweat. The B-17 smelled of rubber, hydraulic fluid, and, bizarrely, cigarette smoke and leather. Baumbach settled into the pilot's seat on the left. The contrast was shocking. A Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighter was a claustrophobic steel coffin. You didn't sit in it, you wore it. The cockpit of the B-17, however, was spacious. It was comfortable. The seats had cushions. There were ashtrays. The instrument panel was a sprawling wall of dials, but everything was logically laid out. "It's like a flying Cadillac," one officer muttered, running his hand over the throttle quadrant. They marveled at the heating system. American crews flew in heated suits and a heated cabin. German pilots at high altitude often froze in their sheepskin jackets. This wasn't just a plane, it was a testament to a nation with seemingly infinite resources. Baumbach fired the engines. The four Wright Cyclone radials coughed, smoked, and then settled into a deep, earth-shaking rumble. As he taxied out and lifted the massive bird into the air, he was surprised by the controls. They were heavy, yes, requiring muscle to move, but the plane was incredibly stable. It wanted to fly straight and level. It was a steady gun platform. But the true revelation came when they left the cockpit. Leaving the controls to a co-pilot, the senior officers moved back through the bomb bay, walking across the narrow catwalk, and stepped into the waist gunners section. This was the heart of the beast. Large, open windows on either side of the fuselage exposed the rushing wind. Mounted in each window was a Browning M2.5 caliber machine gun. The Germans were used to the MG-15 or MG-81 rifle caliber machine guns that fired fast but lacked punch. The American .5 caliber was a different animal. It was heavy, brutal, and ugly. One of the officers gripped the spade handles of the waist gun. He swung it around. The mounting was perfectly balanced. He pressed the butterfly trigger. Thump, 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 thump. The noise was deafening inside the fuselage. The heavy gun didn't just fire, it hammered. The recoil vibrated through the officer's arms and into his chest. He watched the tracer rounds tear into the clouds behind them. These bullets were the size of a human thumb. They traveled flat and fast. Then the officers looked at the geometry of the defense. They moved to the tail, 2 guns. They looked at the ball turret underneath, 2 guns. The top turret, 2 guns. The chin turret, 2 guns. Baumbach stood in the waist section, visualizing the air battle. He realized with a sinking feeling why his fighter pilots were dying. "One of these is dangerous," he reportedly said, "but they don't fly alone." He imagined a standard American combat box formation, 18 of these giants flying wingtip to wingtip. That meant over 200 of these heavy machine guns, all overlapping. The German tactical doctrine had been to attack from the rear, to sit on the bomber's tail and fire. Standing inside the B-17, Baumbach realized that attacking from the rear was suicide. A fighter pilot coming from the stern was staring down the barrels of the tail gunner, the ball turret, and the top turret simultaneously. It was a wall of lead. They also realized that the psychological horror of it. The American gunners didn't have to aim perfectly, they just had to fill the air with metal. The volume of fire was the weapon. As the captured B-17 touched down back at Rechlin, the mood among the high-ranking officers was grim. They had gone up looking for technical flaws. They came down with a terrifying respect. They realized that the B-17 wasn't just a bomber, it was a flying porcupine, designed not to evade the Luftwaffe, but to destroy it. The ocean was no longer their protection. The American industrial machine had arrived, and it was armored, heated, and armed to the teeth. For the Luftwaffe High Command, the math was simple and depressing. By late 1943, attacking a B-17 formation from the rear was mathematically proven to be a death sentence. The combined firepower of the tail gunners, ball turrets, and top turrets created a kill zone so dense that even the best German aces were being chewed to pieces before they could get within firing range. They needed a new angle. They needed a blind spot. And thanks to the captured B-17s sitting on the runway at Rechlin, they found it. The breakthrough happened during a series of mock dogfights. The test pilots of KG-200 took the captured Flying Fortress up to altitude. Buzzing around it like angry wasps were the Luftwaffe's top fighter experts, flying Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. Their orders were not to shoot, but to probe. They approached from below, blocked by the ball turret. They dived from above, blocked by the top turret. They swept in from the sides, blocked by the waist gunners. Then a pilot tried the unthinkable. He swung his fighter wide, miles ahead of the bomber, turned 180 degrees, and flew straight at the nose of the B-17. It was a terrifying maneuver. The closing speed was insane. The bomber was flying at 200 miles per hour. The fighter was flying at 350 miles per hour. That meant they were rushing toward each other at a combined speed of nearly 600 miles per hour. The pilot had only seconds to react before a mid-air collision. But as the German pilot roared toward the glass nose of the B-17, he noticed something crucial. The return fire was pathetic. At that time, the standard B-17F model had a fatal flaw. The nose was covered in plexiglass to allow the bombardier to see the target, but his defensive weaponry was weak, usually a single .30 caliber machine gun on a flexible mount or cheek-mounted guns that couldn't fire straight forward. As the fighter screamed in head-on, the bombardier inside the B-17 was helpless. He couldn't swing his gun fast enough to track the target. The heavy twin 50s in the top turret couldn't depress low enough to fire over the cockpit. The German pilots had found the Achilles heel. It was the dead zone. They landed immediately and drafted a new tactical doctrine. It was called 12 o'clock high. The strategy was simple and brutal. German fighters would form up in mass waves miles ahead of the American bomber stream. They would fly parallel, turn, and come in four abreast, wingtip to wingtip, straight at the faces of the American pilots. The psychological impact was devastating. For the American crews, it was the stuff of nightmares. They would look out their windscreens and see the wings of German fighters twinkling as their 20mm cannons flashed. The Germans weren't aiming for the engines anymore. They were aiming for the cockpit. They were trying to kill the pilots and shatter the oxygen systems. The results were catastrophic for the U.S. 8th Air Force. In the raids over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, B-17s fell out of the sky in horrific numbers. The Luftwaffe had unlocked the fortress's weakness, and they were exploiting it with ruthless efficiency. They had turned the B-17's greatest strength, its slow, steady flight, against it. However, this discovery sparked one of the fastest technological countermoves of the war. The Americans, realizing they were being slaughtered from the front, rushed a modification to the production line. They bolted a powered Bendix turret under the nose of the bomber, equipped with twin .50 caliber machine guns. It was called the Chin turret. When the German pilots tried their 12 o'clock high attacks on the new B-17G models, they were in for a nasty surprise. The dead zone was gone. The B-17 now had teeth in the front too. But for those bloody months in 1943, the secret discovered by the test pilots of KG-200 nearly broke the back of the American bomber offensive. They had looked the monster in the eye and found the one place it couldn't blink. By 1944, the air war had descended into a state of total paranoia. The skies over Germany were crowded with thousands of aircraft, a swirling, chaotic metal storm. In this confusion, KG-200 played its most sinister card. They didn't just test the captured B-17s, they weaponized them as the ultimate Trojan horse. These were the wolves in sheep's clothing. To the exhausted American gunner scanning the horizon after 6 hours on oxygen, seeing a B-17 off the wing was usually a comfort. It meant safety. It meant a little friend. But KG-200 exploited this trust. They painted their captured B-17s in standard U.S. Army olive drab. They sometimes even kept the U.S. stars, violating the Geneva Convention, though most missions flew with German markings that were hard to see from a distance. The tactic was known as shadowing. A KG-200 B-17 would take off and loiter at the edge of the massive American bomber streams. It would slip into the formation, blending in with the hundreds of other heavy bombers. The German crew inside wasn't there to shoot, they were there to spy. They would radio the exact altitude, speed, and heading of the American formation to the German fighter control centers on the ground. The American crews began to call these imposters Judas goats. The psychological impact was devastating. American bomber crews began to look at the plane flying next to them with suspicion. Is that the 91st Bomb Group, or is that the Luftwaffe? Stories circulated in the mess halls of England, stories of B-17s that would join a damaged straggler, lure it out of formation, and then lead it directly into a flak trap or vector German fighters to finish it off. While many of these stories were exaggerated by fear, the reality was strange enough. KG-200 used the immense range of the B-17 for phantom missions, clandestine operations dropping secret agents behind enemy lines. The B-17 was perfect for this. It could fly further than any German bomber. Under the cover of darkness, German-flown B-17s dropped Nazi spies into North Africa, Jordan, and even Ireland. They used the enemy's own machine to prolong the Reich's survival. There was a profound irony in these missions. The German pilots who spent their days trying to shoot down B-17s spent their nights praying that the American engineering would hold together. They grew to love the plane. They trusted its engines more than their own. One KG-200 pilot noted in his diary that the B-17 was a flying hotel, so reliable that it felt like it couldn't fall out of the sky. But as the Third Reich collapsed in the spring of 1945, the game was up. The airfields of KG-200 were threatened by advancing Soviet and American tanks. The order came down from Berlin: destroy everything. The wolves were not shot down in a blaze of glory. They were murdered by their own crews. On airfields across Bavaria and Austria, German pilots rigged explosives to the fuel tanks of their prized B-17s. They watched as the captured giants, the planes that had taught them so much, the planes they had flown as spies, erupted into flames. When American troops finally overran the KG-200 bases, they found only charred skeletons. The fuselages were burned out, but the distinct tail fins of the Boeing B-17s were still recognizable rising from the ashes. The Luftwaffe officers who survived the war and were interrogated by Allied intelligence offered a final grudging eulogy for the B-17. They admitted that while they had better fighter planes and perhaps better pilots, they had lost the war because they could never build anything like the Flying Fortress. They had flown it, they had dissected it, and they had tried to copy it. But in the end, they realized that the B-17 wasn't just a machine, it was the embodiment of an industrial power they could not defeat. The wolf had worn the sheep's clothing, but the flock had simply trampled them into the dust.